say consciousness is fundamental to understanding all of this. This is where, Skywatcher came about. I was the first, quote, psionic asset, kind of put together the initial team there.
When you do feel like you connect with something, how does that foreign information, like what is the phenomenology of that like for you?
Everyone gets this information differently. Like for me, that's clairaudience. So like I can hear a separate voice in my head when I ask for that. It's a very clear inner monologue that does not sound like me. I do think a number of defense contractors have more complete pictures of what's going on than others. But, the psionic side of this, I think, was heavily siloed off, except when you get into the crash-retrieval program. The fact that Jake came out and talked about, the role of psionic assets in crash retrieval was shocking.
When you hear about things like the egg or, Jake's 8-gon, what do you think those are? Like, do you think those are pieces of like technology? Do you think they're things that manifested?
With the eggs in particular, I believe that is manifesting out of something else. I don't think they're necessarily a bunch of things that are, zooming around like, what was it, Mork and Mindy? I do think I have seen enough evidence to know that there are human versions of some of these as well.
Wow.
That are, if you want to call it reverse engineered, whatever, and that probably is the only explanation. I've seen enough evidence to know that we have made some progress there.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. In this one, we return to what is absolutely one of my favorite topics, one of the most compelling, controversial topics in the whole UFO sphere, which I guess is controversial in and of itself. If you've even been lightly keeping up with the channel, you know that I've been beyond intrigued by this topic, the topic of psionics, ever since Jake Barber, former Special Forces operator and UFO whistleblower, came forward. I think it was early this year. Jake dropped a number of nukes. Chief among them for me, he claims that classified programs, or more specifically, elements of the, quote, legacy program, have been working with psionic assets all along. That is, specially trained personnel that interface with non-human intelligence through consciousness, psychically. And according to Barber, these sensitives were not just involved in contacting non-human intelligence, but in crash retrieval efforts. Efforts that Barber himself believes he took part in as a helicopter pilot, recovering multiple downed crafts. So with that historical lore context, I am so stoked to say that I'm finally speaking with a psionic asset, not one who worked in this legacy program, but one who worked with Barber directly in Skywatcher, another just fascinating rabbit hole. And if you're not familiar with them, they're essentially a privately funded entity that is trying to bring about disclosure through actually using some of these same methods we've apparently been using in classified settings for decades. This includes psionics. And if you're not familiar with Skywatcher and this whole tale, it's really worth going back and watching Jake's initial interviews that he did with Ross Coulthard and Jesse Michaels. So anyway, our guest in this one, James Hodgkins, not only is he a sensitive, a psionic, a seeker, this man has a successful career in tech, fascinatingly. And if anything, James strikes me as a guy with a lot to lose by sticking his neck out like this. And for me, that just really amplifies his credibility. So with that, what does it really mean to be a psionic asset? What are these experiences of psychically connecting with non-human intelligence like? What has James seen and experienced? What are these beings, these craft? What philosophy, what metaphysical framework does James believe reflects the phenomena most accurately? Well, my friends, we're going to get into all of this and more in this Mind Meld. First, though, if you would be so kind, like, subscribe, comment, share, make sure the bell icon is turned on. I understand you have this hype button now on YouTube. Smash that for me. And if you want to initiate yourself further and support these transmissions more directly, join up over at patreon.com/third eye drops, or click over to our YouTube members section where we've got an ever broadening, deepening database of content. And if you join either, you will get access to all of it. And by the way, starting next week, we will be releasing weekly patron/YouTube members only content, so it is a fabulous time to join. And with that, I am supremely excited to initiate this mind meld with James Hodgkins. James, I've been looking forward to this mind meld for a while, man. Like we've been going back and forth, and there are a number of reasons for that. I won't get into all of them because I'll just be blabbering on. But really, I think it all stems back to however many months ago that was when Jake's interview first came out, and somebody from seemingly on the inside, for the first time in a very solid way, drew a correlation between consciousness and the phenomena in a way that was not hypothetical or loose, but was very, this is real. There's a history of this. This is a key component to understanding whatever's going on with this. And I came across you shortly thereafter, and hence why I've been emailing you.
A little tough to get a hold of. I apologize, Michael. No, I've been looking forward to this as well. I love your channel.
And on that point, like one of the reasons I was so eager to reach out with you, it wasn't just that. I started to see that we have a very similar sort of panoply of interests. Like you were posting stuff about Western esotericism and the philosophy of consciousness, and like Don Hoffman quotes, and maybe Bernardo Kastrup or something. And I was just like, man, me and this guy, we are kindred spirits. Mm-hmm. So he needs to get in the mind meld at some point. And here you are. And I've heard your sort of, cracking open story a couple times in a couple of interviews you've done. And I think it's a just really important one. So would you mind just kind of starting at the beginning of how, this all came into your life?
Yeah, cracking open. I like that. So to give, kind of the origin story, I guess for me, people talk about what is your earliest memory as a child. Mine is actually of a psychic experience. I was 4 years old. I fell off a kitchen countertop. I hit my head and I broke my arm. And I still, clear as day, can see myself physically separating from my body. My vision, my consciousness, if you will, was floating above my physical form that was on the ground, crying, writhing around in pain, and just thinking, this is interesting. Didn't feel anything about it. And then afterwards, I can't remember having a broken arm afterwards. It's something that I've just been told. But growing up, I learned real quickly that these topics were just kind of off limits. This was dating myself here, late 80s, early 90s. The internet wasn't as much of a thing. And really you had, I like to joke with the Barnes and Noble New Age section was the only way to learn anything about this. So I frankly spent most of my childhood kind of just stumbling through these topics silently on my own, having, a variety of bizarre experiences, from seeing, let's say spirits in the woods behind my house to predicting my grandfather's death. And I just kind of internalized all this, and that's tough for any kid to go through, of course. And then fast forward to college in 2003, I have my first, quote, major contact experience, complete with about 3 hours of missing time. I was also physically moved about a mile from my last conscious memory. And similarly, I knew for damn sure this is not something that that I should be talking about. And so internalized that again, and went through, tried to have a normal life, normal career, successful in my chosen profession. But all along, this side of me was kind of the defining piece of me. And it was only something that I really shared with my wife and a handful of very close friends. Just kind of that fear of derision that most of us have kept me very quiet until finally I reached a point where I knew I couldn't stay. I had to do something big in the public. And I started looking for who else out there was trying to do something major in the way of consciousness. And now, to be clear, like the UAP topic, and we can talk about that as much as you like, that was actually always plays second fiddle to me, as opposed to I was much more interested in the psionic side. And then as we got into this, and a few of us began working on the topic in earnest, we found a number of very important people, as it were, say consciousness is fundamental to understanding all of this. And so, and we can get into all the details that you like, but, all these efforts became, as you were hinting at the beginning, this is where, Skywatcher came about. I was the first, quote, psionic asset, kind of put together the initial team there. And I've been off to the races ever since.
Yeah. And I mean, you bring up another really important point in terms of what made me want to pursue this conversation is that if anything, you actually have a lot to potentially lose professionally by
I was
coming
worried
out in
about,
the
I was terrified of that.
yeah, in this capacity. And Adam and I talked about that. Our mutual friend Adam Curry and I
Mhm.
talked about that a little bit last night. Is that there's a lot of people who privately have interests like this, but they're like you, successful in their chosen field. Like you come from the tech crypto world, and there's a lot of other people in that world that Adam's connected with that he'll tell me about. Is like, oh, this person's super interesting, but they're super private. They do not,
Yeah.
they do not want to come public with any of this stuff. And yeah, so that's another element of it. But anyway, yeah, I couldn't agree more in terms of the UAP phenomenon. The nuts and bolts stuff is interesting to me for sure. Like the stuff about the legacy program and like aerospace contractors. It's super interesting, and I want to know the truth. Like whatever
Same.
different versions of the truth are out there, and that's one of the things I'll pose this question to you at some point is how do you view the relationship between consciousness and those more nuts and bolts things, or is that a smokescreen, or is it, I don't know. That's just a question that looms large in my mind. But before we go there, yeah, I think that's what I've always suspected as well, is that there's less of a division between these various kinds of high weirdness than most people think. And that's why I love thinkers like Valet and Keel and these people, and also like the Western esoteric sort of way of viewing all of this, because it recognizes that whatever is going on, whatever these intelligences are, they can present themselves in a number of ways. And not only can they present themselves in a number of ways, the way your consciousness is situated, the cultural time, the whole palette of concepts that you have access to personally may influence the way that that thing appears to you. And one, that's so exciting, and two, it's so terrifying, and like gives such an massive opportunity for the most schizo projection you imaginable. Um, but yeah, so that initial out of body experience you had, that really interests me, because that seems like a clear example of what you hear about in the lore a lot, right? Like in the lore of individuals who get pulled down a similar path, is like they have some kind of catalyzing experience
Mhm.
that sort of opens everything up, and that's why I use that expression, cracked open. Um, but I'm really interested in out of body experiences in particular, because I had my one and only sort of classic out of body experience just about a year ago now at
Mhm.
Monroe Institute. And I've told the story so many times on the channel, so I won't go into that whole thing again. But when it happens, and it's utterly unhypothetical and hyper real, and it's a moment where you just have to ontologically grapple with that being part of your reality now.
Right.
Like, this is possible. Like, you can have this experience, and I don't know, there's so many other things downstream of that I don't know, but I do know that that's possible now. And some people seem to have it where, like, once that capacity is unlocked, they start going out of body all the time. That wasn't my experience, but I'm curious for you. Was that something that happened to you over and over again, or was it more?
So it did as a kid. So this is what's interesting. And spontaneous projection was something that came very naturally to me as a kid. And then
Hmm.
after that event in 2003, for some reason, it became a lot more challenging. And it's something that if I'm on my game and I'm working on conscious projection, literally every day, yes, it's feasible. But I don't know why in 2003 it became much more challenging. Maybe that was, I think 19. I was right after my 19th birthday when that event happened. Maybe there's just something about growing up, that it becomes more difficult. I don't know. But funny side note about projection and the reality of that, people that have practiced conscious projection are familiar with the, kind of the energetic projection symptoms that accompany that. A lot of times it's the
Mhm.
gushing sounds or hearing voices or the energetic sensations. And for me, I get a lot of heart palpitations when
Hmm.
if I haven't been on my game and I've taken a break and getting back into it, it's almost like your energetic body is like shaking off the cobwebs, as it were. But I wanted to test this one time, and I had an Aura ring. I don't have it on today, but it felt like I was having a heart attack while I'm going through this. And I wanted to see what my aura ring registered as far as like my heart rate being elevated, anything like that. My aura ring registered that I was not just asleep, but in deep sleep while this happened. And so those sensations we feel that I think a lot of people say that's something physical, it's entirely, your energetic body. I think Robert Bruce is one of the best authors that talks about this in astrodynamics. Like this is kind of like you're shaking out of your physical self. And this is another layer to your consciousness that is exiting your body.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was precisely my experience at Monroe as well, and that's like really one of the first things they train you to do is to start feeling these energetic waves and sensations going through your body, and it seemed like everybody accomplished that fairly easily. Like there was almost nobody because we would do these. I don't know if you know the grammar of how these things go, but
Yeah.
basically you do the meditation. Have you been to Monroe?
I haven't been to Monroe. I've done
Okay.
the majority of the focus levels. It's been a while though.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so you're totally familiar with HemiSync, and then when you're doing, the Gateway Retreat, you'll go. Everybody will go down to this kind of central cozy area, and you'll all kind of do a quote unquote debrief and share your experiences if anything novel happened. And yeah, very early on, they give that direction to try to feel these sensations, these vibrations, and it's definitely something that I think in the beginning I was like, is this psychosomatic or is this like neurofeedback where they're sort of like getting you into a really suggestive state and then you think you're feeling it. But then once I had the actual OBE, I was completely convinced. Well, I shouldn't say I'm never completely convinced, but
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I highly suspect that this is real now because when you finally do achieve that state, it's like you just become that vibration. It's like
Mhm.
that vibration somehow houses your intellect and it just separates. And it's just no, it's
Um, this is one of my favorite topics, and sorry to go back to Robert Bruce, but I think he is one of the best writers on this topic. He talks about, we perceive having a lot of failures as we're trying to do conscious projection, but to your point about having, kind of another body or being that is exiting. His argument is that you're actually not failing. It's the inability to integrate the memories of having left your
mm,
energetic body, having left, and then kind of like downloading that to memory in your physical consciousness. And he's got all sorts of tricks in terms of like as you're starting out, make it a couple seconds and then start expanding out from there, as opposed to trying to blast off, to Saturn or wherever.
that totally makes sense. And that's one of those things that I also apologize for anybody that's heard this story, but it's just so relevant. Um, I really do believe that when you're doing deep meditation and you start and you start achieving that like hypnagogic state and you feel the transition of what we would typically just call sleep coming on, and then of course you cross that border and you stop metacognating. You're no longer aware of like I'm James and I'm having an experience, or you just it just seems like time is lost. But when you meditate over and over and over and over again in that way and you keep approaching that line and keep approaching that line and then slip into sleep and come back, slip into sleep and come back, it starts to feel like information, like leakage is occurring
Mhm.
between the two, and you can sort of gain an awareness in whatever that other mode of consciousness is. And I highly suspect that going out of body, being asleep, the hypnagogics, all of these things, they're all deeply interrelated. And I don't have it by any means figured out. I have not like mastered this or
Mhm.
anything in terms of how you create that porousness and keep the continuity of experience. But it was enough to suggest to me that it could be done for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And to go back to Monroe, I've got a couple friends that are working through the gateway process together right now. And I was joking with them the other day that Focus 15 for me is
Hmm.
I could stay there permanently. Like I actually find that to be that out of time. I think it's called out of time state is how Monroe
Yeah.
talks about it. That to me, and the ability to do patterning exercises there and whatnot. It's kind of that void state. Void sounds a little bit spooky,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
it's just, I don't know. To me, it's very serene and peaceful. I love that.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And just to touch on focus levels for people that don't
Yeah.
know
Sorry to
this
bring that in.
system. No, no, it's all good. It's all good. I think it's a fascinating point to bring into the conversation. The idea is so the most common ones are 10, 12, 15, and 21. Those are the ones that you'll do if you go do a gateway retreat or you get your hands on the recordings or whatever, those are the ones you'll find. And then 10 is supposed to be mind awake, body asleep, where you just get deeply relaxed. 12 is supposed to be what's the exact terminology they use?
Expanded awareness.
Yeah. And then 15, like you said, when you're doing the meditation, whichever version you're doing, I like the old school ones with Bob's voice.
Mhm.
He'll be saying, like you're now exiting space and time, basically. And the idea is in focus 15, like you said, you're sort of in this non-local space. And what's interesting is I was reading through the the declassified gateway paper on the channel a while back. And what's interesting is I believe they used to refer to focus 15 as like it might have been like more like a time travel type thing, like accessing the past or something.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I thought that was really, really interesting. And then another thing that's sort of I found to be enlightening in that paper was the idea that you could do focus level meditations hundreds and hundreds of times, and very few people will actually achieve the focus level. And he said this is particularly true of 15 and 21, is like almost like he said a very low percentage of people actually ever achieve whatever focus 15 and 21 are supposed to be. So I thought that was really interesting as well. And yeah, made me kind of look at everything differently.
Yeah. And so 2 points further on gateway. So I think a lot of that is quite similar to trance states, whereas trance states are, before I did the gateway program on my own, trance states are achievable. You could get down to the vibe of focus 15, if you will, but formalizing it, making it programmatic, I guess would be the word, where, you're literally just able to say, okay, now I'm going to, visualize the number 12. I'm going to drop down to 12. Once I get there, I'm going to go to 15, is really, really powerful. And that's also the reason why I've had a bunch of like quote normie friends since I came out as a psychic that said, how can I, begin to experience this? And if they're willing to do gateway long enough to get to even focus 12, where you feel your mind expanding, that really seems to open people up to the realm of the possible, and that there is something to this. It's up to them if they want to do the work to, continue on that, though.
I can totally see that. And for me, I'll be totally transparent. I never had a really convincing experience of contact that was brought about by doing hemisync. And what's funny is I was, and I'm sure you're aware of this idea, most listeners that have heard the mouth noises spilling forth out of me are probably familiar with this idea. But for anyone that isn't, there's this pervasive idea basically in all of Western esotericism that you have a guide or a personal daimon or something, the Greek terminology. And my goal going to Monroe was actually to have a undeniable experience of that. That's what I was really seeking. Like the out of body state was actually a way, like, I was like, I guess that would be interesting and cool if I achieve that, but I want to talk to my guide. I want to talk to my daimon. And I don't think I accomplished that. Ironically, I got exactly what I didn't want. The one thing I did get because I was going into every meditation with that intention, was I got a very clear image of what appeared to be a clock. And I took it as meaning like it's not time. Like it's just sort of like sort of like a symbolic, the right time isn't now. Or maybe it's time for something else or whatever. And in my experience, that's often how what I perceive to be outside intelligences communicate, is through like symbol and through not discursive kinds of information, or not linguistically. What is it like for you on that note? Like when you do feel like you connect with something, how does that foreign information, like what is the phenomenology of that like for you?
So everyone gets this information differently. And I do think it's something that can go from being highly symbolic and subjective and more open to interpretation to actually being linguistic. Now, I do think everyone kind of has one of the clairs, clairaudience, clairsentience, clairvoyance, that they naturally are probably better at. Like for me, that's clairaudience. So similar to, and I don't mean this in a joking manner, but similar to people with mental health issues, like I can hear a separate voice in my head when I ask for that. It's a very clear inner monologue that does not sound like me. It could be masculine, feminine, etc. And for me, over having done this, for a very, very long time, a lot of times that is very, very clear, like not open to interpretation. Here is the message. Now, this is, a 3-hour conversation in and of itself is what degree of confidence do you put in those messages? Because we can have the best intentions for whom we're trying to contact. And at the end of the day, sometimes it is difficult to know, am I speaking, to the being, whether it's a, discarnate human or otherwise, that I intended to. And so that's the difficulty and the challenge with this. And that's where I see people get into trouble, is when they start making very blanket dogmatic statements that this is what I was told and this is the way things are, or this is what's going to happen. And recently, we've seen that with 3-Eye Atlas. I know the jury's still a little bit out with 3-Eye Atlas, but I can't tell you how many people had prophecies of doom and gloom about 3-Eye Atlas. And, here we are. So,
right. Yeah. Yeah. I totally agree that you have to be extremely careful with any kind of apocryphal or apocalyptic or any kind of predictive sorts of statements that you receive in an altered state. And it's paradoxical because I'm hugely fascinated by, channeling, and particularly ancient forms of like oracular and divinatory kinds of revelations. But what's really interesting about those compared to modern day channelers is it seems, again, much more symbolic and poetic and
yeah,
and musical and not overt. It's almost like it's establishing a riddle or something around something that they perceive, rather than like the army is gonna breach the castle gates next Tuesday or whatever. It's not. It's more,
don't invade Thrace because X is going to happen. Yeah,
right. Or it's something, and I don't know if you've ever read any of these, like the Chaldean oracles or any of these preserved texts. They're all written in this like hexameter, and in this sort of like where you're almost struggling to understand what they're even talking about. And that's more of like a visionary text. Maybe that's not like the best example, but my understanding at least is that's how it was. And I think that's tapping into something fundamental about how consciousness works underneath the surface of the more subjective, or sorry, not subjective, subconscious kind of consciousness that's like pre-language. It's much more symbolic and qualitative than quantitative and determinative or something.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fascinating topic, and it does make me think about the Pythia, the Oracle at Delphi, and like you said, it is very, very prosaic, and it's really only after the fact that you're like, aha, this is what the Pythia meant. It does make me think about, scientists have talked about perhaps there were fumes that were being influencing the mind of the Pythia, and that led to a little bit more of an ecstatic state, similar to, a DMT type experience, perhaps. And so I can say, because I'm very fortunate to know a whole bunch of psychics, and how different people receive messages. And a lot of times it really is only clear after the fact that this is what was meant. And I think one of the other problems, you hit on time earlier, and time is a fascinating topic when you get into channeling, because I do not think it works the same way on, quote, the other side. And there's a term, there's a podcaster that I like, Gordon White, I think is the one that talks about omen logic, where if you are trying to say, I don't know, will the Patriots win their game next Friday, something like that. Well, that doesn't work because there's a time element there that just doesn't really translate very well. However, with, quote, omen logic, if you say, will the Patriots win the Super Bowl this is a bad analogy, I'm struggling with it, but if you tie it to something like the midterm election,
Sure.
something that is a huge kind of global event that's going to have large reaching impacts, that is a better way of going about, quote, prophecy than saying, will X happen by Y date? Because that really seems to cause a lot of problems. And you see this also with mediumship, with talking with, discarnate humans, where, you ask them, what are you doing right now? What have you been up to since you passed away? And it's like, there's no real concept, at least that I've encountered, of like, well, it's been 6 months, and over the past 6 months,
Right.
I've done this, that, and the other.
That totally makes sense, that it wouldn't work like that, and that, sort of chronological time would be more of like a physical world kind of construct. Um, and this reminds me too of, there's stuff in the Gateway paper about this. And also, I've gathered this from speaking with some of the Stargate remote viewers, is that you can sort of run into similar challenges with remote viewing to exactly what you're talking about, where you're trying to gain a specific piece of information using um, whatever you want to call remote viewing, non-local perception.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be oftentimes very difficult to extract very specific information or strings of numbers or whatever the case may be. It's much easier to get sort of a gestalt and a feeling than it is specific information. And I think I heard too that you have some experience with remote viewing, right?
Yeah. And so there's a lot to that statement that you just made. And I do think getting exceedingly clear. Okay. Well, so I'm mixing terms here. Let's break remote viewing into viewing a target that exists in current state. And then I think what you're also talking about, which is precognitive remote viewing, or associative remote viewing, is typically the technique that is used to predict a future outcome. And so when it comes to remote viewing something that exists in the real world, that unequivocally can be done with extreme specificity, down to, you've heard of, stories from the Stargate program of people, which one? Joe McMoneagle reading files that he wasn't supposed to be reading in an SA facility. And so that is unequivocally achievable. Now, you're right. Things get weird when you're trying to use precognition to predict the outcome of something. And so that's why associative remote viewing is such a powerful protocol. Associative remote viewing is the protocol that most people associate with that, wherein you basically can tie binary outcomes to, you have an image A and an image B, and you are blind tasking the remote viewer, whereas in the background, you have tied an outcome to target A, is yes, and target B is no. You send a feedback cycle that says, please describe to me the image, which I will show you next Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern. And if they drew target A, that answer is yes. Now, this works the majority of the time. It doesn't always work. And to your earlier point, these do tend to be, when you introduce precognition, it seems to rather drastically ramp up the difficulty level. I've heard from one of the SRI scientists told me that about 60% accuracy is considered like fairly world-class for being able to do ARV reliably. And this gets to one of the things I've found as I've met, a bunch of scientists and people that are really serious about trying to crack open our understanding of how psi works in the body, is the repeatability problem. Right. And there is, I've met a lot of people that want to get involved in these space, and they say, well, if it works one time, it should work every time, because that's how, scientific materialism works. It should be a repeatable experiment. And it's not always. And we don't, perhaps at some level, like if we were able to plow billions of dollars into research and could understand every single little finite variable that is impacting us, from, geomagnetism to solar activity to what I ate that day, and factor all that in, maybe we'll get there someday. I don't know. But today, that repeatability problem is one of the real barriers I find to explaining this to quote normies, I guess, probably not the audience of this channel. But that doesn't discount the fact that there has been, people say, well, there's no proof of psi. Like, there is reams and reams of experimental research documenting this. And, one of the main skeptics told one of my friends privately, that basically you don't, if a peer-reviewed parapsychology paper comes out, it's best not to assume they've made any mistakes, because the bar is so damn high for publishing that,
Yeah.
you know, their methodology is locked in, and there is a lot of that. So, you know, it's not all negative.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's so many interesting experiments. Like, you know, the one of them, I think it was one of my favorites is the one I think conducted by Bem, who was measuring neural activity and could see that you know it's the experiment where people are being shown a sequence of random images basically,
Mhm.
and then every now and then there will be like a shocking or like erotic image flashed in there.
Violent, something, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and you could see the spike in brain activity, like the excitatory activity before the image was shown. And this is something that was repeated over and over and over again, I believe. Eric Wargo talks about it in his in Time Loops, and it's just like um, a well known psi experiment that always sticks with me. Is like what other explanation for that is there? Like
Yeah.
there really isn't, that we like, other than we have some kind of capacity that knows before we consciously know. And that in and of itself is like such an interesting little koan and such an interesting little microcosm of what I think is so interesting but frustrating about psi. Is it's like there's something about it that's not really under your control fully,
Mhm.
and it's happening behind that metacognating um blurry line or border that I was talking about before. And I think that there is something key there where you have to go below that or above that or whatever preposition you want to assign to it.
Mhm.
And I don't know how that's done, and I'm not sure if anybody really knows how that's done. It's almost like you have to fool yourself into doing it. And I think
Yeah.
in fooling yourself into doing it, you're also maybe introducing other problems where you're mixing too much of the conscious mind. I think of like a lot of performative channelers. You know, for
Mhm.
instance, when I'm saying things like this, I won't name any names because I truly just don't know, and I'm not that deep into that kind of stuff. But whenever it becomes too performative and too on demand, I start to be like, I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know. I think there could be some ego or performance mixing in with the legitimate information. But what are your thoughts on that kind of channeling?
Performative channeling. Okay. So I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this. If you're, I have seen so many people get into this field with the best of intentions, both psychics, authors, people in the disclosure space. And the problem is, if this is your sole source of income, at some point you need to
Right.
perform. And if you're a channeler, it doesn't work all the time. Like, it's not 100% accurate. I'll give you a really funny example from a couple weeks ago that was immediately disproven that I did. I was speaking with a friend that is a whistleblower, and we were doing some psychic work, and I made a few predictions based off the questions they had asked me. And some of those came true very quickly. But one of the last questions they asked me was, will the Age of Disclosure documentary ever be
Hmm.
released? And I said, no, it's not going to be released. Literally 12 hours later was the announcement that Age of Disclosure
That's funny.
was coming out. And so no one is accurate 100% of
Yeah.
the time. And I think for when you get into performative channeling, that's where things have to get vague, to
Hmm.
where it can be right, it can be wrong, or after the fact, if you tie these 7 pieces together, that person was right. And I think that really pollutes it. You know, I've done medium sessions for friends that want to contact dead relatives that don't really believe in this stuff. And not all of it is going to blow their socks off, but typically I can get 2 or 3 things that, you know, I'm thinking of a recent one where, you know, the woman was in tears afterwards and she knew that her father lived on. Um, and that to me is much more powerful. And, you know, it's not something that I charge for, because I have, you know, I have a mundane existence. I have a
Right.
normal job. I'm not trying to make money off of this. Now, I completely applaud and I empathize people that are, because I'm very fortunate that this didn't destroy my normative career like you talked about at the beginning. Like, I got very lucky. The fact that I work in tech and crypto where a lot of people are secretly really interested in these topics.
Mhm.
That's not true for everyone else. If you work in a medical field, something like that, that'd probably be career ending. So I respect people that make that leap, but I think it's a really tough wire to walk of maintaining credibility and paying the bills at the end of the day. It's tough.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Now that you brought up Age of Disclosure, what's funny is Adam Curry and I were gonna watch that last night,
Nice.
and because of it was Thanksgiving Day, and we had both just like moved to a new area, so we both had nothing to do, and we decided to go out and try to get food, and that wound up taking like 5 hours because everything was closed, and then the few places that were open were absolutely packed. So we just it wound up being super late, so we didn't watch it. But have you seen it?
I have not seen it yet. I've
Okay.
seen all the. Go ahead and ask what your follow up question. I no,
Well,
but I haven't seen it yet.
Well, I was going to take this as an opportunity to hinge more into, UFO and disclosure and legacy program stuff proper, because
Yeah.
I would imagine, with your associations at some point you've done a deeper dive into these subjects,
Mhm.
and the subject of like the legacy program in particular is very interesting to me. One, because of course it's like such a black box and people are trying to piece together what it is. Like one of my primary questions is like, is this a coherent thing that is understood to be one thing, or is it a bunch of different things going on with different people leading different aspects of stovepipe things where they're not all talking to each other, and this company A is doing this and company B is doing this and they have no relationship? Or is there some, majestic 12 type entity at the top like orchestrating all of this stuff? And then of course, this term psionic, well, maybe not the term, but the practice of psionic involvement with this legacy program seems to be a thing, at least based on what Jake has said publicly. But so how deep of a dive have you done into that, I guess, is my first question.
Yeah, I mean that's to be, and this is rude. I just haven't had the time to watch Age of Disclosure. I do intend to watch it, but
Me too.
to me, you and I are not the audience for Age of Disclosure. I think this is something that you recommend at Thanksgiving dinner to your family, to see people like Marco Rubio talk about the UAP phenomenon, and that in and of itself is extremely powerful. Now, getting into the legacy program, is there a Majestic 12 or the cigarette smoking man from the X Files coordinating all of this? I don't think so, based off what I've been told. I think these are heavily compartmentalized. I do think a number of defense contractors have more complete pictures of what's going on than others. But, the psionic side of this, I think, was heavily siloed off, except when you get into the crash retrieval program. The fact that Jake came out and talked about, the role of psionic assets in crash retrieval was shocking. Like I've said
Yeah.
this to him and I've said it publicly before. Like, I think if we would have stayed very narrowly focused on the fact that there was a retrieval program, as opposed to that psychics were being used to, summon them, perform HICE, whatever you want to call it. I think that would have been easier for the public to kind of digest than the fact that these are something that responds to non-local consciousness, which isn't even something that people really believe in at this point. I saw a Pew Research study comparing acceptance of UAP topics to, I think they called it the paranormal, and
Hmm.
UAPs were much higher than
Interesting.
paranormal topics. And this is even like, seeing a ghost in your house. It's not much less, summoning orbs in the sky and, helping to bring them on the ground. So I do think the way the government works, I think, is, kind of like a hydra with a bunch of different heads. It has a lot of inertia and forward motion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that each head entirely has the complete picture, if that makes sense.
Totally. No, it totally makes sense. Um, I've been so interested specifically, though, in however this psionic element of this supposed legacy program was introduced. Presumably, and I don't even know the timeline. I guess in my mind, I've always thought, well, maybe something like Stargate is a, we look at that like it was this unique, singular. aberration of the military industrial complex being interested in remote viewing for intelligence acquisition, whatever. But maybe that's just one tiny, public piece of something, or some public scapegoat for something that really continued going on in deeper, darker programs in different kinds of capacities, including something like this. I've had Lynn Buchanan on the show, and he has told me like he deeply believes that there was, in air quotes, active mental work sorts of programs that were going on in other sectors that, he talks about hypothetically, but with seemingly a pretty high amount of certainty that it existed. He called remote viewing passive mental work. It's just non-local witnessing, trying to gather intelligence. But what about remote influencing? What about other darker kinds of psychical sorts of tasks that you could try to apply to people? So I guess circuitous way of asking you, how do you think these things became a thing within this legacy program, to your best guess or
So
knowledge?
people have disagreed with me on this, and actually, if we keep talking about Adam Curry, Adam would probably know this a lot better than I would. But my understanding is that really a lot of the early psionics work came about as a response to the Soviet work on the same, and the fact that the Soviet Union, dating back to the Tsarist, the imperial times, you had the Russian cosmos, you had a much more acceptance of, let's call it, spirituality and psionics than we did in the West, in the U.S. in particular, at that time. And despite we think of the Soviet Union as this godless, materialist, atheistic society, that definitely wasn't the case. And so I think a lot of this was us being pushed there. Now, that's also discounting the fact that there was a lot of professional research in the West about this. Like the Society for Psychical Research dates back to the mid 19th century, and took these topics very seriously. You also have there's this book from, I believe, the late 60s called Executive ESP that was from the Newark College of Engineering, of all places. And I don't think NCE is around today, but it's this absolutely fascinating study of looking at executives in a business environment and how they make decisions and what their outcomes are versus people that purely make decisions based off of analytical research. And it seems like if you go back and look at, when you talk to the Stargate researchers, a lot of them are older, so they'll turn you on to the books written in the 60s and early 70s. There was a lot more acceptance of these topics in the mainstream. Like financial astrology was a whole thing. You can find that stuff on X if you look for it today, but you try telling a Wall Street trader, well, this is, a bad time to trade because of X, Y, and Z, they're going to laugh at you. There were periodicals and journals that were dedicated to this that circulated on Wall Street in the 50s and 60s. And so I think we have just gotten more and more materialist from the 70s on to where these topics became verboten. But the people that, were devoted to doing classified research on them saw the potential of them from a national security lens. And that actually is one of the areas that, as I, have brushed up against the national security space over the past 2 years or so, that I've seen is that if you come at it from that lens, that's often the type of response that you get. So if you are trained in your entire career is to view everything from a threat-based lens point, I get it. That's your background. That's what you were paid to do, as a civil servant, as a, service member, et cetera. But there aren't many people out there, other than kind of conversations like this that are talking about it's not entirely a national security threat. There is the phenomenon exists along the spectrum. There is I'm not discounting the negative, scary stuff at all, the stuff related to nuclear weapons. And, but there's a lot of positive too. It's like, I often say this, it's like humanity. There's good and bad humans. Most of us are in the, kind of happy medium.
Yeah. Yeah, and before we get too far away from it, if you have you read the book Phenomena by Annie Jacobson?
Um, no, I haven't.
Okay, I think you'd love it because it's just
Okay.
it's a really comprehensive overview of um, the not just the military industrial complex, but a lot of the intelligence agencies' interest in psychical phenomenon, going all the way back to World War II with the Nazi interest in the esoteric, and then that flows into people like Puharich and gets into the whole Stargate era, et cetera, et cetera. But and MK Ultra, of course, I mean, it could go back that far, right? I mean, maybe it goes all the way back to these um like famous supposed crashes that happened, like who knows. I mean, um do you have a sense of when this interest started?
For the US in particular, because I
Yeah,
think this, okay, I was going to say, because this goes back to the dawn of civilization in
of
my
course. Yes,
mind,
yes, yes, yes.
from, monarchy, in the ancient times down. I don't specifically know. I mean, you bring up, I completely glossed over Puharich and the, what was it called? The Round Table Foundation up in Maine.
I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And the fact that you had, Peter Levenda was just on American Alchemy,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
I
yeah.
have recommended that podcast to anyone that'll
Mhm.
listen, because I think Levenda is probably the one author that has like most impacted my thinking on all of this high strangeness. And he was highlighting the fact that, I think this is in Sinister Forces, that you had like the Astors there, which were one of the most important families, turn of the century, Brahmin class of Americans. You had the inventor of the Bell helicopter was participating in these. You had Gene Roddenberry,
Oh wow.
the
Star
Star Trek,
Trek.
Star Trek
Yeah.
creator, and this is, and I would say like that probably ties back into spiritualism, and the fact that hiring a medium to your party on Saturday night in the Upper East Side was like a big part of high society in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so I don't think any of this, I think it has always been an undercurrent. I think this gets into kind of a wild topic, but like information used to be so centralized that most of us had no access to any of this. And now with the
Mhm.
decentralization of information and the fact that you can have someone come out that previously might not have any type of following, that has something interesting to say and could substantiate it, and they can have a global audience within a few hours. That's what's changed and allowed all this to seep out. And I think that's incredibly powerful. Now, the flip side of that is it's much easier to slip disinformation in there. It's,
Oh yeah.
it is harder to control the narrative than it used to be. Like I hear that criticism a lot, but then I think back to, the fact like the Vietnam War, you had Walter Cronkite and the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was a false flag attack, but it was presented to the American populace as truth. And there was no one else to say otherwise back then. Now there's dissenting voices.
Yeah. Yeah, the informational soup is thick with ingredients. I don't even know if it's a stew. It's like it's a soup. It's like
Sewer, maybe.
it's a sludge. It's a sludge. That was a Freudian slip. That was more accurate, I think. But yeah, I haven't caught that Lavenda interview yet. But yeah, he seems extremely brilliant, extremely knowledgeable about the esoteric and the history of all of this stuff in all of its capacities, in all of the ways that we're touching on in this conversation. And for people that don't know Andrea Puharich, I'll do my best to give a quick nutshell. But he starts out as a medical doctor. I think he becomes interested in sort of like vital energy or vital force within the body. It's also funny how that's a concept that goes back to like every ancient civilization and esoteric tradition, but everybody wants to come along and rename it as if it's like something they discovered or that
Yeah.
they're gonna like make the final breakthrough on, when it's like, hey, sorry, like the Greeks have been talking about pneuma, the Indians have been talking about prana for thousands and thousands of
Yeah.
years.
Or Reiki and orgone energy, which,
Yeah, totally.
Reich's work was suppressed.
Yes.
After his death, I think he was jailed, and then his work was censored and suppressed. Like, very bizarre. And
Yeah.
there's like I'm sorry to derail your point,
No.
but there's like an entire subset of people I've found that are dedicated to researching orgone energy today for cancer research and things like that. So
Wow.
there are quite pockets of this. Sorry, go back to Harch.
Yeah. No, for sure, for sure. And so he ends up somehow getting funding from all these bigwigs, like you mentioned some of them, to essentially do psychical research. And then he gets, tied up with the intelligence agencies, MK Ultra, and sort of, I think, Stargate later on, at least tangentially. But I think by then he's considered to be a little bit sketchy, so people involved in SRI kind of keep him at a little bit of an arm's length, but he's definitely connected with Geller. And then they have this whole like, they believe that they're in communication with this being they call Spectra, and it's this whole crazy, like, tangled history, but it's super fascinating. And for
Yeah,
anybody that wants to know the overview, that Phenomena book does get into all of this. But it does highlight that, at least in a limited but powerful way, people very near the top of finance and the government and the military industrial complex have been interested in psychical phenomena, high strangeness, UFOs for a very, very long time.
absolutely. And you had, I think Puharich invented the hearing aid as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So fascinating individual, but you're right. And like, this is one of the, you mentioned the connection with Uri Geller, and that's kind of where, let's say the wheels fell off a little bit in terms of his reputation. But like, that's the fear I have is people spend longer and longer in this space, is that you go so far down that rabbit hole. And Keel talks about this a lot. This is the Chapel Perilous. Was it Keel that? No, that was
Robert Anton Wilson. But
right.
maybe Keel too.
Yeah,
I mean, I think the two of them are very similar in a lot of ways. Like, Keel's a couple decades earlier, but I think they had a similar sort of mischievous, multifaceted kind of approach. Yeah.
But that Chapel Perilous always is looming large in the background for me, is that these topics can, once you look in the abyss, as Nietzsche said, it tends to look back at you. And I've seen a lot of people succumb to that.
Totally, man. Yeah, and the Chapel Perilous is so alive and well, no matter what you're doing, even if you're just trying to sense make in this informational environment. It's such a hall of mirrors. It's so difficult to distinguish between your own bias and reality, and it's a crazy time to try to sense make, particularly if you're into these topics. That's why I like that you often talk about the importance of grounding yourself and the importance of having, like, a solid foundation before you even, like, dip a toe into this stuff, because it can get so delulu and so schizo so quickly if you don't have your feet on some kind of level ground. Maybe we should touch on that for a minute, because I'm sure you've dealt with that a lot, and had to sift through a lot of that in looking for legit people. And
I tend to bucket these practices into life affirming or life denying practices. And what I mean by that is the whole idea of, like, living a very ascetic existence, like a monk, where you spend, 10 to 12 hours in meditation per day. I have friends that live like that. I don't think we incarnated to do that. I think we did incarnate to have, like, a real human experience, to actually have challenges and lessons. And I think with that, these topics, to me, enrich my life in more ways than I can ever imagine. But at the end of the day, like, after we're done with this interview, I have to go put Christmas ornaments on the tree with my kids. Right. So I think having that level of grounding allows us to explore these topics in a safer manner, and still viewing the forest for the trees, as it were. And my friends that I've seen get into trouble are the ones that don't necessarily have that. And that's where the voices do kind of start to become a little bit all-consuming, or, they become a little bit darker and negative. And I think you just need to, like, as we say, go out and touch grass. And that's why I think when you look at, we're exploring these topics with outside of a spiritual paradigm, which I think is completely achievable. But you look at other traditions that have real mystical traditions, such as, if you study Kabbalah in an actual Jewish context, so Kabbalah with a K, you typically need to be 40 years old and married before a rabbi will let you explore these topics. Similarly, in Vedic culture, mysticism is not a young man's game. It's an old man's game. It's after your kids are out of the house and you've, kind of wrapped up your career. All right, now it's time to get super weird.
Yeah.
Whereas we're studying these topics much earlier, relatively earlier in life, I guess. And you just need to be a little careful.
Yeah, and as you actually took the thought right out of my head in terms of that's why I like a lot of these more classical initiatory traditions, because it was definitely the same way in Platonism. Like,
Mhm.
you didn't show up to the Platonic Academy looking to, you know, initiate yourself into those intellectual and I believe probably also esoteric mysteries that were not publicly printed.
Yeah.
Particularly by the time you get to like Iamblichus and stuff, it seems to be very clear that there's a lot of esoteric stuff going on. Um, in an
Yeah.
initiatory, very magic-y kind of capacity, but you didn't show up there until you were classically educated. You knew mathematics, you knew rhetoric, you read all of the Hellenic philosophers. Like this was something for educated people who were already, brilliant, and then they started to dedicate themselves into this more mystical, mysterious territory. And I think that should tell us something. I
Yeah.
think,
And
yeah.
it's all available today. 90% of it is available. Like, I think my 20s, I was obsessed with Kabbalah. That's why I brought it up
Yeah,
earlier. And
I kind of
it
was
was
too.
all
Yeah.
at my fingertips. I was reading Rigardi's Garden of Pomegranates and Gershom
Hmm.
Scholem's Sefer Yetzirah translation. And like, it's all there, but I didn't have any of that
Hmm.
foundation that's built over a lifetime in that system or tradition. And I'm not saying I don't believe really that all these things need to be closed practices necessarily, but you need to go in with your caution lights on that it's pretty easy to get a little bit untethered in these traditions.
Yeah. So given that you are into Western esotericism, that you did have an out of body experience at a young age, that you are interested in channeling all these different, modes of experiencing the mystery, I guess you could say. How does that inform your understanding of what the phenomena is when you're out there with Skywatcher, or you're doing something appears in the sky? What explanation makes the most sense to you? Is there a thinker that you most closely resonate with? Do you sort of mix and match? Like it's pretty clear you probably don't just think it's the standard extraterrestrial
Mhm.
argument, but are you a Keel guy? Are you a Valet guy? Are you a their ideas mixed with esoteric ideas guy? What do you?
The longer I do this, the less convinced I am of any of that.
Mm,
And I'm weirdly okay with that, but I do tend to veer way back into Neoplatonic thought. There are some problems and some challenges with that. Like, I don't entirely agree with the cosmology, as it were, but
mm,
Iamblichus was writing about this in third, fourth century
yeah.
AD, about
Hmm.
the observer effect and the fact that the expectations of the individual influences what is observed.
Yep.
And like, my God, I can't think of a better explanation for what we've experienced with the quote UAP phenomenon over the past 100+ years, from airships to flying saucers to triangles to orbs, etc., and everything in between to freaking jellyfish. Now, I'm not sure what that says about about us as
Right.
humans, but it just gets weirder. And it doesn't discount the fact that, as Grush has said, like, there are biologics, there's a retrieval program. Like, there wouldn't be a retrieval program if there wasn't anything visible to retrieve in the first place. And weirdly, these things also respond to human initiated contact. And so I think it's a diversity of phenomenon. I definitely don't think it's one thing. I do think it still is possible that there are, within our three-dimensional universe, there is, extraterrestrial life. I do believe that. Whether it can reach us or not, not 100% sure. But, if the laws of physics aren't as we understand them, I think that would be easily achievable. And so I think the one thing, and I'm so guilty of this, is when we use the word phenomenon, it's not one thing. Like, and
Right.
it's a bucket term that makes it easy to infer what we're talking about.
Totally. And that's one of my like gentle gripes with someone like Keel, because I deeply agree with him more than I disagree with his like ultra terrestrial hypothesis, that it's a nutshell that whatever is going on here, we need to think more in terms of there being sort of extended layers of reality and energy and consciousness. Um, and that's where these things reside. And then
Mhm.
whatever physical forms they manifest in, it's like a momentary mask, or it's a permutation of an intelligence that really exists on a level that is not physical at its foundation. But
Mhm.
where I start to have a gripe with him is when you, and kind of Valet in a way too, is when you try to boil it down to like one multi-faced thing. Like
Mhm.
why one? Why not a whole kind of ecology or panoply of non-physical reality
Yeah.
and beings like that? And that's where, again, I like you, I go more into the Neoplatonic and Hermetic way of viewing this, where it was understood that we lived in this either uh, kind of stratified reality where you had this realm of daimones or spirits or and angels and gods and whatever, and then there's sort of like kind of like that border we were talking about before in human consciousness. There's basically a border you cross that is a non-physical kind of border where you get
Mhm.
into what the Platonists would have called the intelligible realm, which is like
Right.
the realm of mind. And I think that that is probably the most like mixing that with like Keel and Valet is what I think is probably the most durable, sophisticated way of looking at it that I've come across, at least.
Yeah, that makes sense. And people that are very, very serious about astral projection, to kind of bring this full circle to the beginning of our conversation, talk about a really diverse spirit ecology out there.
Hmm.
That, on the astral, this is not just one thing. Like you bump into all sorts of, what they jokingly refer to as astral wildlife, and some of that is good and some of it's bad. And then you think to the, I always tie this back to mythology and folklore, stories of the Fae, the Jinn, the
Hmm.
Devas. Like most cultures have a story about um, sentient races that exist just outside the spectrum of reality as we understand it. That might have actually been the precursors to humanity, and then like the Fae stories are about them, kind of being uh, pushed out, as it were.
Yeah, yeah. So now that we're on this topic, and again, like there's this alchemization that at least I want to do, which is trying to understand what is the overlap between all these things that we're talking about. Jinn, fairy, daimones, spirits, ghosts, whatever, and what from the outside looking in exoterically would be called the UFO phenomenon. And things that are seemingly material, like these biologics, like these crafts. Are these things related, or are these things, different kinds of high weirdness that exist in their own sorts of under their own sorts of headings? How have you come to understand this?
So this is one of my favorite topics, and I, once again, you'll hear me say I don't know to a lot of things, but that's just because collecting evidence, proof on any of these is the challenge, obviously. But and I've talked about this before. My contact event in 2003, I didn't think of that as UAP related whatsoever for like 8 to 10 years, probably, until I had a one boss that I told it about and told about the experience, and he turned me on to ballet. And
Hmm.
I interpreted that as a fairy encounter, that I,
Wow.
you know, uh, don't know exactly the specifics of what happened at the time, but it chose to present itself in that way to me. Is in, hey, James is always the nerdy kid that likes folklore and mythology. He's probably pretty inclined to accept this, as opposed to flying saucer landing in front of him. So that's where we're going to give him. Now, is that the phenomenon? Taking an archetype that James understands and using that to make it more palatable and acceptable to me so that I had less cognitive dissonance or didn't fight back? Maybe. And that's a question. But this gets into, most of the religious traditions in the world talk about sublunary spirits.
Yeah.
I think that actually is a Neoplatonic or Hermetic term
Hmm.
that, spirits of the air, spirits of the earth, like elemental spirits that exist just outside of the phase of reality. And we have ascribed all sorts of, typically negative meanings to those. But the one thing I can be sure is I have never encountered a being I would say with 100% certainty is like that etheric, when people talk about like our 5D ascension and all that, like I've never encountered that. I've also never encountered something that I would say is like 100% demonic. I've encountered very human-esque motivations and levels of interest. And nothing so dark that I'm willing to say like this is all evil and that if it presents as good, it is putting on a mask for some purpose. Conversely, I don't think it's all good either.
Yeah, super interesting. So, well, I guess you jokingly use the example of seeing a UFO land in front of you, and one, I just have to ask you, as someone who was essentially part of a group of people who was trying to make that happen. One, have you had an experience like that, or close to that, or what is the closest experience to that you have had? And two, I still want to dig further into what you think the relationship is between something like that and this whole panoply of ideas of beings.
Yeah. So the most shocking experience I've had in the past couple of years has actually been with my family. And I've talked about this story a little bit in the public before, but my wife and kids, we were going out for dinner. We were coming back and we were talking about human initiated contact. And they said, would you do it? I said, yes. So we stopped at a nearby beach, did it. It showed up and it said, one of the questions I always ask first is, can we film you? I got a no response. But it showed itself for wife and kids. It was kind of a classic orangish orb. Wrap that up, drive home about 5 minutes later over our very small coastal town. And I'm not kidding. This was maybe 50 to 100 feet was a gigantic black triangle just hovering over like this Main Street, USA in a very small town. And it had like the classic 3 lights and all that. And, it was startling enough, like my wife screamed in the front seat next to me. And so we slam on the brakes, get out in this, because we hadn't talked about, can I film you or not? I was definitely getting out to film this, and then watch that morph into a passenger jet. And it was hovering over the street previously. And then it slowly starts moving forward in the shape of a passenger jet. And so these things change shapes, and I don't know what you do with that.
Wow. So what do you do with that? Do you think that was a physical thing that had the ability to like obscure itself? Do you think it was a psychical thing?
This felt very physical. So that's a very good question, actually. The orbs, by and large, feel very etheric. They are very like, I remember at the first Skywatcher event, we were sitting up on this balcony, just contemplating the mysteries of the universe as they zoom around. Like it made you feel like very introspective, and like it was an awesome experience. This thing was definitely felt physical, and very materialistic and similar. I've talked about this as well. The drone flap in New Jersey and along the US East Coast, we got that as well. And that felt very different also. It did respond to HICE. So I don't think it was just one thing. I think there were probably a mix of things, whether that be our own red team drones or whether that's, Chinese technology, Russian technology, but it did respond to HICE. And so once again, I think we're pumping into a bunch of different things. And that's the fun of this is the experimentation and, doing this in groups, whether it's just, a group of friends getting together and doing this and comparing notes and all having those vertical experiences together. Like, I think that is super powerful.
Wow. Yeah. So two other roads I want to go from here. One is, so let's stick with the triangle for a second. Have you seen anything with Borland since he's come out?
A little bit. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I ask because, he's a whistleblower who's come forward from the Air Force. I think he was Air Force Geospatial Intelligence, if I remember correctly. Okay.
I think he was NGA. Yeah.
So he claims he was at a base, and I do think it is publicly known which base, but I don't remember, that had a NASA hangar at the base. He was doing some kind of third shift thing. He went to this gazebo he always goes to smoke, sees a strange light appear above the NASA hangar, and he's like, "Oh, they must be testing a balloon or something. That's weird that they'd be doing it in the middle of the night, whatever." But then after a while, that thing starts coming closer, and it becomes clear to him that it is a triangular large object, kind of like what you described. It
Mhm.
has this almost like iridescent sort of um mother of pearl
Shimmering effect. Yeah.
shimmering thing on the surface of it, and he feels all the hairs on his body stand up. His phone starts malfunctioning, and then the thing just like silently takes off at an insane speed. um do you think what you saw could have been something like this?
So the lights were different. If I recall, and this is why I think it's not just one thing. I think the craft Borland described, I remember seeing this and being like, oh, someone else had this experience. But I think his had a large white light in the center, whereas mine didn't have a center light. It had three on the points of the triangle.
Yeah, like the classic TR3B sort of looking
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, exactly. And so there were differences in this. Now, the fact that he's on a military installation that is associated with NASA, I think is probably very different than whatever responded in the span of, 5 minutes to me doing HICE. But I don't like that triangle was the first time it felt a little bit threatening. If I'm being honest, and because it's not something I've never had a triangle show up in HICE, and I would argue like it showed up in response to the fact that I was doing HICE, maybe in kind of a flippant manner for my wife and kids. That like, okay, maybe it's time to tone it down. I don't know.
Yeah, this is something you hear that sometimes when people are doing CE5 or psionic type things, that a luminous orb like thing will appear, or one of the more ethereal looking things will appear, and then in conjunction with that or after that, some kind of triangular thing like what you described may appear. This sounds like one of these occasions.
Yeah, I early on, and this is probably like when I first started experimenting with HICE, or CE5 was the oldest game in town back then, maybe like 7, 8 years ago. I live in New England. If you're familiar, Bridgewater Triangle is kind of like Massachusetts's version of the Bermuda Triangle, except it's on land in the swampy area in southern Massachusetts. And I had a group of friends that went down there to do CE5 and had some really terrifying hitchhiker effect type situations that followed them for a little while after, and it really like put me off and scared me. But I think the area that you do this, I think also has a tremendous impact. And Bridgewater Triangle is frankly associated with some pretty spooky phenomenon, not positive, not whimsical paranormal, but a little bit scarier stuff like Skinwalker Ranch type type situations. And I think there are those window areas like Skinwalker. The area that we did the first Skywatcher event, was fairly well known for that. The follow-up events also was selected because of it's kind of like a hotspot area. And so that's another area with unlimited time and resources I'd love to explore is, how weird can it get in these kind of window areas?
Are those areas still secretive, or can you generally talk about them?
So the first area for the first Skywatcher event I can talk about because I think it was in the documentary. That was near Palmdale, California. And which Palmdale sits near, it's near a number of military installations. It's near China Lake. And so all of this was factored in the sense of, the technical team had to be very careful of whatever we were seeing, that it wasn't a military flight, because it was also like sandwiched between Lockheed Martin and one or two other like testing sites. But it makes you wonder why they picked that. And we said this afterwards, that there was, if you Google Palmdale UFO flap, that corresponded at the same time that we were there doing this HICE over a week. It lined up perfectly, and people were seeing UAPs all over that. It's like right on the edge of Death Valley, pretty desolate area. But yeah, I mean, it correlated perfectly to when we were there.
That's crazy. And I mean, it must have crossed your mind how do we know that we're not seeing some sort of exotic technology associated with one of these companies? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
And
sure that must have been a point of discussion with everybody on site.
yeah, and that's why, as opposed to, if James is going out there as a layman with, with his friends, like I'm not going to have the technology to understand that. But the tech team, led by other James, does have the understanding and the equipment to be able to tell like what is, because weirdly, actually, we saw this, like even the classified flights are still registered. You just don't know what they're up to. So we were able to see that.
So speaking of that's the other route I wanted to touch on. You brought up the drones and the fact that there's all this conflicting stuff that was going around the news and the internet at that time. But I know Skywatcher was out there on the East Coast before they had anything to do or publicly to do with what you were involved in. But was there a psionic presence with them at that point, or were they just out there trying to figure out what was going on with the drones? Or
Out there trying to make sense of it,
okay,
as in trying to help the state of New Jersey, frankly, understand what was going on. Actually, Jake and I joked because I'm not that far away from New Jersey. I was like, "Hey, I'm happy to drive down." And at first, Jake was like, "Oh, that'd be interesting," and he's like, "That's probably not a great look to bring in psychics to state of New Jersey operation."
Okay, so no psionic involvement in the drone stuff.
Not for me, no.
Okay. Um, so one of the things that you would hear is, um, oh, these things do not show up on FAA. You know, well, I don't know what the right phrase is, but obviously everything that's flying is supposed to be registered with the FAA, is supposed to have certain kinds of lights on it. And it seems like, yeah, these things had lights. These things seem to be following, certain FAA regulations. They're probably like just classified drones that were being tested. But then there's so many other questions about like, well, why would they do this over such a populated area? Is this some sort of psyop? Is this hostile? And of course, there's conflicting things from even people within the government saying it's a hostile government, it's not a hostile government. What's your best guess at whatever's going on with that?
So I tried talking to them. So I did, because like I said, we saw them farther up the coast in New England at the exact same time, and like to the point where my kids lost interest in UAPs. Can you imagine being a kid and like seeing UAPs enough? And this wasn't me. This is just like the drones are everywhere. And once again, a UAPs unknown. I'm not saying that all of those are anomalous in that regard, but similar. This was actually around this time last year. Went out there, did HICE over the coast, and one showed up, and it was big enough and close enough. It actually like startled me. Materialized out of nowhere. The lights were on, and it was like, it seemed like it was kind of at tree level. It was nighttime, so I couldn't make out like the specifics of the shape. But I asked, why are you here? And I only got a single response, and it said, "Show of force. We want you to see us." And I couldn't get anything after that. Now, that was the only, and I've talked about channeling and telepathically communicating with UAP before on other interviews. That was the only time where like I got one response. That's all it would say. And then it was silence afterwards. So I don't know what to make of that, but it was not that etheric introspective feeling. It was a kind of militarized feeling.
Oh, wow. Okay. So back on this topic of what it's like to actually communicate with these things and experience these things. You've already said it's kind of different across the board for everybody, but are there any experiences that stick out in your mind in terms of either an internal sort of feeling of established communication that you had and something showing up, or a member of the team had and then something showing up? And if so, what was that sort of chain of events?
Sure. So the nice bit about working with a team is that someone is probably going to be able to get a response. And so typically we're going to take turns to figure out who is the person that is actually getting that. We all have different ways of doing it. Like, and I've talked about this. Mine is very partnership driven. Basically saying, in the spirit of partnership, we'd like for you to show yourself. Could you move closer to Big Dipper, the Orion, etc.? Others, it's that classic, love and trust. It's not my style, but I have a friend that has incredible results doing that. But to your point about what are the commonalities? So I have a very weird physical sensation when I know something is about to appear. We jokingly called it my early warning radar, where I get a vibration behind my right ear, which read into that whatever you'd like. I don't know. But that usually is a very good sign of like, get the cameras out. Something is about to happen.
And was there anything else like that for other members of the team or occasions when you're out there and someone was like, I'm having this kind of an experience, I think this is about to happen, and then it did happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's the classic clairsentience,
Okay.
where there's just a knowing of, someone's getting really excited because something is about to appear. Now, the hard part with all of this, and I'm not a camera person, but, at least early on, there was a very expensive, very sophisticated film crew. How do you tell them where to point the camera? Like, we don't get enough specific information to say, in that random blue part of the sky, something is going to appear. And you've heard in the later Skywatcher documentaries, like, not all of that is visible to the naked eye. So like in the early days, all we had was naked eye ability. It was only later that, more advanced signals intelligence, I guess, was possible.
So on the topic of not being able to capture, the phenomenon as well as you wish you could, capturing it aside, what were some of the most compelling experiences you guys had collectively in terms of, things that maybe you couldn't capture on camera or whatever, but that you did experience?
So some of the stuff that we did outside of the actual HICE was very validating for me. Okay, I'll give you a very specific example. So Jared Garcia, who is the CEO of Conscious Contact Works, was out there as part of the Psionic team, and he had brought a EEG with him. And now we also had Dr. Gary Nolan, who brought a like laboratory grade EEG, but because those are so delicate, it actually broke in transit. But Jared had a Muse, which is not the most scientific EEG in the world, of course. It's not going to pass Adam Curry's test. But I was doing a very long channeling session with Dr. Nolan, and I was wearing the Muse, and Jared was monitoring my brain waves. And I don't remember if it was the delta or the theta waves, whichever is associated with kind of like trance introspective states. Gary would ask a question, I would get a response, and you would see a very brief spike in either the delta or the theta waves. Like I said, I don't remember at this point. And this was like clockwork. Anytime it was like the radio turned on to receive something, and then it dropped straight back down. And I'm doing this in a full waking state. I'm not in like a trance state or anything like that. And so it was a pretty shocking. And I remember, I think Gary was very impressed with it as well. The fact that this doesn't seem to have been very well studied. The fact that when people are doing channeling, there is a correspondence in the brain.
This kind of sounds similar to that occasion where Bledsoe was hooked up to a EEG on the Skinwalker Ranch thing, and they were able to show.
I haven't seen that one. I didn't watch all of that.
I've only seen the clip of it, but yeah, it's something like that where they had him hooked up to something, and he established contact, and you could see something on the brain waves that looked novel.
But this is a great example of like. Sorry to interrupt you.
No.
One of the most frustrating things I've encountered over the past 2 years of trying to like, I'm not a scientist, but I want to see science better understand this, is there is a ton of research to be done. Little things like that. Like you've got, my experience, Chris Bledsoe's experience, things like that could incrementally move the needle, but securing funding for those things and going through, I was a part of one study where, we filed the IRB, what is that called? The Independent Review Board and all that. My God, the amount of like red tape and dotting I's and crossing T's that it takes to get one of these studies to the point where you actually can run the experiments is incredibly time intensive. It's expensive. Finding the candidates is challenging. And there's no real, at least in the US, there's no one doing this today. Like there's a couple groups out there. Like there is a nonprofit in Brazil that I think does a lot of really cool research. But it's getting, these scientists the money to do these damn things while they have bills as well to pay is almost insurmountable. It's very frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. And that brings up the point of you really need to have people who are just both interested in this stuff and have shit tons of money to
Yes.
move the needle on anything. And that's a rare combination of things. And that's, I think, what was so exciting for outside observers about Skywatcher is it just seemed like this rare opportunity for those two things to come together. And I think a lot of people, speaking for not that I speak for the entire community, but I think a lot of people are like, whoa, this is so exciting. This could be the thing that really catalyzes something or moves the needle on disclosure. So I guess I'll just ask you bluntly, like, what is your feeling about that and the state of, like, in air quotes, disclosure in general? And do you feel like you got any kind of personal disclosure out of everything you experienced in Skywatcher? But I also am interested in the collective sort of version of that question too.
Yeah, I 100% got my own personal experiential disclosure in working with Skywatcher. And so I'll be forever grateful of that. And I'm not involved in Skywatcher anymore today, so I can't speak for them. But this is the whole idea, was that a well-funded organization that can drive forward citizen disclosure. But I would actually take the other side of what you just said about how excited people were. And I would say it felt like we were being crucified, that this costs money. Like the Fowler's equipment is very expensive. That's extremely technical stuff. Booking a place for a really large team to stay for a week, all that costs money, having a place to do that safely, et cetera, out in the middle of nowhere. And I think what I got, like, very, very dejected, kind of the first half of this year, that people think, yes, they want, quote, citizen disclosure, but they think it should be free. No one should be allowed to even, like, receive a living wage. No one is getting rich off of any of this. And so that was very disheartening to me. It made me, like, really question, like, what did I want my level of involvement to be? I don't mean with Skywatcher, but with these topics in public. I don't mind, like, the personal ridicule of talking about being psychic in public, but I do mind people thinking that this is just magically going to come out of nowhere, where it's really a lot of sweat equity and work, and frankly, a lot of personal suffering and beating down people like, Jake and Fred in particular for trying. It's just really annoyed me.
Yeah, I can only imagine, because obviously once the wick is lit and it just explodes, right? And it goes into we were talking, I think before we were recording, we were talking about how the UFO phenomenon is like the perfect canvas for projection, right?
Yeah.
Well, so is this, like, in a lot of ways, like, whatever your preconceived notions are about it, there are so many sufficient unknowns about, okay, there's this group and they're trying to do this. And he's talking about that at some point, this was being used to draw craft in and then, forcibly down things and then recover them. And then people think that that's what you're trying to do. And then people also think, no, this is disinformation that's trying to distract from something real that they don't want us to know about. Like, and it's funny because you could go either way with it, right?
Yeah.
You could say that the technological stuff is a red herring for the psychical stuff because that's what's real. Or you could just flip that around and say, no, the psychical stuff is a red herring to distract away from the technological stuff that they don't want us to know about. So yeah, it's just, there's just so much opportunity. And then you can just read into, well, why would a rich person want to fund this? What do they want to get out of it? Are they going to try to steal this technology? And, and I get all that, but I also think that if you're being a rigorous thinker, you just have to withhold judgment until you know more information,
Yeah. And I like the idea that we're going to tell you that this group exists.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go shoot something down.
Yeah.
Why on earth would we tell anyone that if that was the objective? Like, that makes zero sense. So that's the one that I always found the most hilarious. But people, like, it some of the team is extremely resilient to this. Others, it definitely beats them down and makes it so they don't want to be publicly involved in this space. And, I, other than being, a quote psionic asset, like I don't have, I'm not a scientist. I wouldn't even call myself a researcher. I'm an experiencer, and I would say an explorer of these topics. Doesn't make me want to be in the public anymore. If all the community does is like criticize every effort,
Yeah, I can only imagine, man. I just have the privilege of trying not to look at shitty comments, and like, that's pretty much the worst I have to contend with, other than the occasional like complete wacko. Um, but on that question of broader disclosure,
Uh-huh.
as somebody who is interested in this topic clearly, like deeply from a seeking perspective and a sense making and a spiritual perspective, do you think disclosure in the way that it is envisioned in the sort of UFO sphere, one, do you think it is a thing that could happen? Like, are there entities within the government, that could come forward and really create some kind of ontological shock with what they know? Or would it have to come from a more kind of holistic, spiritual, first person perspective? Or is there maybe some harmony of those two ideas that could occur?
I think it's a harmony of those two ideas. I've said this before. I think disclosure happened in 2017 and no one cared, with the Tic Tac videos and the revelations around ATIP and OSAP, et cetera. And we're still like Age of Disclosure is rehashing a lot of that material to a larger audience than I think has probably taken place in the past. And that's important. And perhaps these things just do take time. But I can tell you, like, even in my own family, like my whole family knows that, knows the Skywatcher story and all that at this point. 60% of them probably won't even acknowledge it. I don't think disclosure in the sense of everyone being like, there is non-human intelligence. We might not even know what that NHI is, but humans aren't necessarily the most sentient top of the food chain. That life is a lot more complex. I don't know if everyone even cares. And so when I went down this path 2 years ago that ended a year ago with me coming out in the public, I initially wanted to wake up everyone. And I thought like, this was an opportunity to help drive that citizen disclosure idea, which I still do believe in, but I'm more now looking for, like a show like this, where you probably have a bunch of people that are curious about this, might not have, taken that first step into exploring these topics on their own from an experiential basis. But that's what I want to really encourage and push out there, is that this is experiential. Getting back to that Neoplatonic thing, there is an observer effect element to this that I do think is achievable to a number of people. And that's actually, ancillary to Skywatcher, but very related because it's all the same people, was that Esalen/Any event, the event that was done at Esalen. To me, that idea, I actually think is a way to drive the needle. And, once again, someone has to pay for all of this. But that was kind of a beta test of, could you take some people that were curious, skeptical, but curious, and wake them up to the reality of this? And I would say that was achieved then. And like the conversations right after that, everyone was so invigorated by the joke was the Woodstock of consciousness, like, just 100,000 people, maybe the event, all you have to do is you got to fly there and find a place to stay, but the event's free. And, we're going to try to put on a show and see what happens.
I hope somebody does that. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up that event. I was talking to Adam Curry about it a little bit last night. Could you just explain the event and what happened there? Because something did happen, right?
Yeah. So I had a personal conflict. I wasn't able to go at the very last minute. So I was not there. But what happened, there were a whole bunch of people are very focused on the blue being or the blue craft that showed up. They're actually, throughout the couple days that it went on, there were numerous demonstrations of psychic abilities. And some of this are now more in the public, like the kids that can read books blindfolded, as an example. So they were there. That was demonstrated. Mind sight, at the Esalen event. But the blue being was that shocking event that really woke people up to the reality of this. And I think you can always draw criticism. Same thing as like if you go see David Copperfield, or I'm dating myself, I don't know how, the common stage magicians today, like you can always find faults in things like mindsight and stuff like that. Doesn't matter how it's done. And there are some rigorous things, like the books had to be in front of them. They couldn't be behind them, as an example. Like, okay, that's kind of interesting, despite they're blindfolded. But something as shocking as that, where unless someone is flying a gigantic blue drone, off the California coast, that is really undeniable. I think that's kind of the way to do it. And one of the weirdest things that I don't think people I haven't seen talked about publicly, is a lot of people came away from that event being able to do this on their own. And it's kind of like, if you are exposed to HICE, it kind of rubs off. And then this is something where you're able to do it afterwards. It's almost like contagious. I don't want to make it sound like a virus or anything, but that's the best explanation.
Right. And I'm sure that there's a particular subset of the people listening who'll be like, it's the hitchhiker effect. It's exactly that. It's like psychically parasitic or haunted or something.
Yeah.
But and I guess that's a fair point.
Yeah.
Like,
if you want to take it to a scary place, go for it.
Yeah.
That's, I do think you largely with these topics, you get out what you put in. And so if you're looking for that in the phenomenon, that's what you might encounter. Now, that is discounting a lot of stories of, I've met numerous psychics that since early childhood have had really terrifying, 100% negative experiences, nothing positive. And most of their life is about grounding and shielding all of this out. It's not about experiencing it. They don't want to experience it. So I don't want to discount the fact that there are a lot of children that, and adults that have struggled with that their entire lives. But I have found that the lens you apply to the phenomenon, back to Neoplatonism, is kind of what you get back. And I have a close friend who's, funny enough, we knew each other in our early 20s. Neither of us knew that we were either was psychically inclined, and we reconnected now in our early 40s.
Oh, cool.
And, but this person, worked for the intelligence community for like 15 years, in private sector now. And so their mind is trained through that national security lens, like we talked about earlier. And so the messages that she receives tend to be often viewed through a threat-based lens. And so there's a lot of, a lot of doom in there, a lot of negative prophecies. And frankly, they've gotten a lot of them correct in terms of natural disasters and things like that. But me, I'm not wired that way because I don't have that background and I don't get much of it.
What was this person working for the government in a psychical capacity?
No, not whatsoever.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Completely mundane.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And to just zoom in a little more on what happened at Esalen. So there was this event. It was like, what was it called again? Enya?
Enya.
Not Enya, like the
not the band.
Like
no.
the new age.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was a sort of meeting of various minds in the consciousness space and phenomena space broadly, right? So there's people who have publicly said that they've been there. I know like Ross Coulthard has said he was there. Some other Skywatcher people were there. Adam has said he was there. And there are a number of other people, but it seems like the moment that was like the massive holy shit moment of this whole event was that some kind of blue orb appeared. And not only did it appear, and I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not, but there's like pictures of this, and there might be footage of it. I'm not sure, but I've seen a picture of it, and it is.
I think the pictures have leaked. I'm pretty sure you can find them if you look hard.
Yeah, and it's undeniably something.
Yeah,
it's undeniably something. Like, could it be fake? Of course. Like,
when I saw it, right after it happened, someone sent it to me, and that was a holy shit moment for me as well.
Yeah.
This is very, very compelling. To me, it even kind of looks like a being. It doesn't really look like a craft.
Yeah, I've only seen it like briefly one time, and I don't have a copy of the picture. But was that brought about by a actual psionic attempt to manifest something, or did it just show up um
It was
generally
brought about
around the
by a
community?
psionic attempt.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Can you say anything more about that?
I wasn't there, so I don't want to get into the. I'll let that person tell that story. I'll put it
Okay.
that way. So
Got it. Got it. But anyway, yeah. I mean, I really do hope that there's more events like that, and I do hope it's something that can be scaled out. And maybe it's hard because really getting, I've been to some events recently, and even though everyone's interested in that, there's such a social element to it that it's not like it's hard to get everybody to drop down into a really
yeah,
expanded state of consciousness where they're focusing on this intention of even if it's just meditating or let alone blasting out loving kindness or something. People are going to be talking and laughing and like
yeah,
not
that's a very
so
good point. Yeah.
that's hard to do, I think, on a really large scale. But I do think you could get at least a small number of people together who would just willingly pay their own way to go. I mean, I
Mhm.
would. If I knew you and a bunch of other cool people were going to be there, it's like we can get a few dozen like really locked in people. Like, let's fucking do that. I would love to do that.
Yeah, and I think you hit on a huge piece of this, which is the intentions that you go into the event with. And like the first Skywatcher event, I didn't know what to expect. I'd met I spoken to Jake on the phone. I hadn't met anyone else from the team other than the Psionic team. And there's obviously, you've seen the videos, there's rifles, there's military gear, there's
Right.
night vision goggles, all that jazz. But as we start the week together, I led like a group guided meditation. And the fact that, all of these, soldiers and airmen are perfectly willing to get on the ground and, meditate, go through a guided meditation. That, funny enough, we actually I used part of the gateway process to get them down. And then I think 2 or 3 of them actually had a shared experience in that. But it was,
Interesting.
I think it was the fact that we went in with, it was almost, like, not to put a tech bro term on it, but it was like setting the vibes of the week. Let it be really successful.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I didn't know that were you doing like a focus 10 or something?
Yeah, I took them down to focus 10 and then kind of blast off into space, as it were, and then let them explore.
Fascinating. That's really cool. So I guess I have to ask you point blank, did you ever get anything successfully to land? I'm sure you've heard that there's like rumors out there now, people saying like something landed. And I've actually, I'm not going to go, I'm not going to betray anybody's. All I'm going to say is I've heard conflicting things on this from
Yeah.
people that I think know, but since you're one of the people involved directly, I have to ask that question.
I will be careful with my words here. I have not been a part of a intentional landing like that.
Do you think anyone has, or are you not sure?
I'm not sure either. I know I can guess who your friend is, and I know what they're referring to. I wasn't there, and
Okay.
I also know that supposed event there wasn't a camera crew there, and so this is the challenge with all this is it becomes hearsay.
Right.
And to be honest, I think this gets into the whole trickster phenomenon.
Yeah.
I don't think my most shocking events have been largely private. The phenomenon is really much more willing to show up when it knows it's not going to be on camera, which, what do you do with that? How do you tell a skeptic, like, well, this really did happen, but it just didn't want to be filmed? Like, who on earth is going to believe that? And that is the reality of it. And so I think, the fact that, getting anything on camera isn't just a grainy cell phone video. I think it's challenging enough, but getting something that dramatic is a big challenge.
Totally. Yeah. And that is a grail that I am still pursuing. Like I have had private experiences for sure that have been unbelievably powerful. The out of body experience is one of them. I had a mind blowing experience in Peru drinking ayahuasca. I've talked about a bunch of times. Other experiences with altered states that are truly, the most sacred experiences of my life, but none of those are completely within the realm of my
Inner
own
experiences.
and I don't want to say my own mind. I think they're probably within the realm of mind with a capital M.
Mhm.
And but yeah, it's different than being with other people in consensus reality and being like, there's a thing right there. We all see the thing, let alone that thing landed. And then there was some kind of intelligence within that thing, physically or not.
Yeah.
Which, circling back to that question, I think we did cover this already, but just another like specific example. When you hear about things like the egg or Jake's 8 gone, like what do you think those are?
As I came over this object for the pick, there was this overwhelming sense of emotion.
Is it your feeling? Are you suddenly having a mental breakdown on the job?
No, I felt like something connected with me. I felt like something had tuned in to me and my soul and was providing me some sense of guidance. Once it was just me and that object in between the pick and the drop site, there's about 20 miles in between, I felt like something was inside of me. I felt like I was possessed by the most beautiful spirit I'd ever been possessed by. And
Had you ever had an experience like this before?
no, it was a very feminine energy, I'll tell you that. It felt like the spirit of God, but not in any masculine sense.
Like, do you think those are pieces of like technology that were built? Do you think they're things that manifested and solidified? Like, what is your understanding of these things?
So once again, I think it's all of the above, but I actually do think the two examples that you gave or the two explanations you gave are both correct. I think with the eggs in particular, I believe that is manifesting out of something else. I don't think they're necessarily a bunch of things that are, zooming around like, what was it, Mork and Mindy? the
Right,
80s show with Robin Williams.
Which is a super weird.
Yeah. Yeah, an egg. Yeah. I mean, it was a joke back then, but now you're like, huh, well, what did that,
Yeah.
were they picking up on something in the ether? And so I think that's, I had a whole point around this. I do think that's a piece of it. Now, I do think, and I actually, this is one of the weirder topics. I have seen enough evidence to know that there are human versions of some of these as well.
Wow.
That are, if you want to call it reverse engineered, whatever, and that probably is the only explanation. I've seen enough evidence to know that we have made some progress there.
Would this maybe be like a Tic Tac type thing?
No, more of the saucer variety. I know we taught, like, I've heard the stories about Tic Tacs, the Tic Tac being Lockheed Tech, I think. I don't know anything about that, but I have knowledge of a saucer that almost like jokingly human in form, in the sense of like, you think of like a naval vessel that's like in gunmetal gray. There's nothing all that flashy about it. That's kind of like the saucer technology I'm talking about, where it still is kind of like the lowest bidder, as opposed to something that looks, bright sci-fi and sexy.
Yeah. And I mean, this is hinting at, a realm that may be outside your area of expertise, but I still think you've been closer to this stuff than I have and 99.9% of people listening. So I have to ask do you think the technological part of disclosure, as it is popularly understood in people interested in this milieu in general, do you think something like a sort of hidden strain of physics and propulsion, do you think that that's real?
1,000%, yes. And I think Eric Weinstein talks about this a great deal, and I 100% agree with it, that there are simply branches of math and physics that are deemed kind of off limits. The fact that, tying this to AI research recently, I know there's the new, what was the program that was just announced that is like the Manhattan Project for AI.
Isn't it Stargate?
Yeah, that was.
Yeah,
I didn't want to
dude,
say that because I couldn't remember.
I was sitting up late one night when Trump gave that speech, and I was deep down the rabbit hole of Project Stargate, and I had already been to Monroe fairly recently. And when he said that, I was just like,
A pretty
what?
wild sync,
Like,
yeah.
what? Why are you like? Why are you choosing Stargate?
That name,
What the
yeah.
fuck? Yeah.
No, I don't. I've seen people infer this that has to do with the UAP phenomenon, and I don't think that. But where I'm going with that statement is, I think you're going to see, like, we're going to start treating AI like a national security threat, and I think that's what has happened with a bunch of these branches of physics and mathematics. And I mentioned orgone energy earlier.
Right.
The fact that all of that research was wrapped up, censored. I don't know if it was actually classified. Tesla's research. Tesla's research disappeared right at his death. I think he had a trunk of papers in his hotel room or something like that was magically disappeared in the middle of the night. And so I think there's a lot of evidence of this. And I know, like, Jesse at American Alchemy, he's all about T. Townsend Brown and electric gravitics and all that.
Yeah.
Yes, 100%. And that's, I get branded with the woo woo, and I am a woo person, but there is unequivocally technology. There are, censored and classified branches of technology, physics, and math, 100%.
Yeah. It seems, I mean, I'm too dumb to know. It's like,
I don't pretend to understand it either.
Yeah. You could give, like, anybody who is like remotely sophisticated when it comes to physics could just hit me with some absolute sophistry, just wow me with a bunch of equations and stuff, and I'd be like, yeah, seems legit. I don't know. I wish I did. I wish I was more fluent in that language. But yeah, another interesting part of this conversation too that I've talked to Adam about a fair amount is plasma, and that plasma could be like this almost intermediary form of matter that maybe you could get things that solidify, that start in a plasmatic form. That's not, it's not like a known material of, of course, blah blah blah. It's a fourth state of matter. It's not a liquid. It's not a gas. It's not a solid. It's this almost proto material that seems to be somewhere between the quote unquote ether and the material realm, and it may even be intelligent. Like if you read the most well-known books on this topic, or the most well-known book on this topic recently at least, is the New Science of Heaven book, and by Temple. Have you read that by chance?
No, I haven't.
Okay.
I keep saying
you've
given me a bunch of new books to read, so I promise
yeah.
I actually do read it. Sounds like I don't in this conversation.
No, dude, I'm a serial starter and not finisher of things, and yeah. But yeah, in that book, it goes from a fairly prosaic, there's actually the universe is mostly plasma. Like when you see nebulas, stars, all these things are plasma. And not only that, but there's some interesting overlaps with consciousness. And then he goes straight into, I myself have communed with plasma-based beings. And it's just like, it quickly goes there.
Yeah.
And if there's a there, that's incredibly fascinating. And that could have huge implications for the phenomena and hidden branches of technology. But I don't know. I just don't know.
Yeah. The sentient plasma hypothesis is obviously, it's the new hotness. Like it's sexy. Lots of people talking about it, and it's something I've heard in the orbit of Skywatcher as well. But there's one scientist in particular I'm thinking of that's non-public with these topics, shall we say, and that's very ill to die on. That is what we're dealing with, and I think that the idea that something physical can manifest out of that, like it's almost. Go back to Platonic forms, it is like it's able to materialize into something else. It's almost like pre-matter. I don't know a better way to describe it, but yeah.
Yeah, and it is very fascinatingly and evocatively, or it can be at least, geometric, and almost like you're creating little, and Adam has said this on my podcast, so I'll just say it again. He said it's almost like you can make little galaxies on the lab bench.
Oh wow.
Stuff like that.
I like
where
that,
it's just like, what do you even mean? And now I've seen pictures of some of these things, so it's not just talk. It's something that really exists, or at least experimentally can exist. And what does that mean? I don't know, but there's something in me that suspects that it could be part of a proto language of creation and symbol and meaning that we don't really understand.
Yeah, I like
But
that. You tie in nebulas as, like star nurseries and things like that.
Yeah.
Like it's what everything else condenses out of, I guess. I like that. Yeah.
And they kind of look like sacred geometry. They look like, I mean, I'll see if I can actually show some pictures of this, but it kind of looks like the same, like golden ratio, spiral patterns, like flower of life type stuff that you've seen throughout the ages at like sacred sites. And clearly that's hinting at something. And, I like to think at least that maybe that's hinting at a layer of knowledge that one can be initiated into or can connect to with the right sort of tuning or something like that.
I think you're onto something.
Who knows?
I also, the longer I do this, the more I think the universe has a sense of humor as well. That there is a playful, I mean, there's certainly with the orbs, there is a very playful element to that. And so it makes me wonder, with the, the golden ratio, et cetera, being, maybe those are, it is a symbolic language, but I almost think it's like something the uninitiated, to use your term, might gloss over, but the initiated see the kind of a guiding hand there. What that guiding hand is.
I might as well say this for the billionth time. That's what supposedly was on the outside of Plato's Academy. It said, "Let none ignorant of geometry enter here." So maybe that's all part of it. Hey, brother, this has been a lot of fun.
Yeah,
we went all over the place in a way that I love, in a way that I think a type of wonder dip that the audience really appreciates.
Good.
And knowing that you have been so close to so much of this firsthand, but that it's still so clear that the mystery is very alive for you, and you're not pretending to know the secrets of the universe. And that's kind of my favorite conversation to have, because it feels so authentic and so wonder facing. So I guess like the last thing we haven't touched on is, like, if somebody does want to have an experience for themselves, is there a couple pieces of advice you'd feel comfortable giving, or at least sort of ways to approach?
Yeah. So coming at this from a very different angle. We already talked about it. I do think Gateway is a wonderful way, particularly for a Western mind, to step into this, because the Gateway process creates a very analytical approach to altered states of consciousness. And so, like I said, I've had some friends that, didn't make fun of me and said, like, okay, I want to experience this for myself. I don't believe you, but I'm willing to try this. And that did wake up a few other people. The other first step into, like, quote, being psychic, this sounds so basic, and I've had a couple people take it seriously and they're like, you're right, is leaning into your intuition as a first step. And what I mean by that is those tiny little premonitions that we get throughout the day, not synchronicities, but being at the grocery store, knowing someone is looking at you from behind, or, knowing that, there's a parking spot down this one row, just those little things, stopping and recognizing those for what they are. That's kind of like that is the reception of non-local information. Most importantly, though, is writing all this down, because even today I found some of my wildest, most profound psychic experiences, getting back to that topic about astral projection, where you're not writing it to memory. I'll give you an example. Earlier this year, I had this conversation with someone, and the entire conversation, I knew what was coming out of their mouth, like, beforehand. Yeah. And I like couldn't even focus because it was so clear, like just premonition after premonition of what they were going to say. I completely forgot it until 6 hours later in the day. Something was said and it was just like joink. There was everything. And so I stopped and wrote it down because I didn't remember it, because it was pretty shocking. And I think the act of writing each of these little things down, and it doesn't have to be detailed, stops your conscious memory and says, okay, this is important. We've been filtering all this out for Michael, but now Michael seems to care about this, so we're going to notice it more often for him. And then over time, that really ramps up. And it's not like there are some decent books that are written about this, but those little intuitive things, like, that is what this is intuition. This is not a very overly analytical process, although Gateway can help you experience it that way. I don't go in for complex protocols. Like people say, what is your, even like remote viewing. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the remote viewing community because I don't have a protocol. I'm pretty darn good at it. I'm sure someone's going to tweet at me, let's see your results. But I don't think these are very intuitive internal processes, and you don't have to over-scientize them.
Yeah. No, I think as mundane as it sounds, that advice about the journaling or writing everything down is incredibly important. And it's also something that you'll find immediately if you take up any kind of like Western esoteric magical logi type practice. One of the very first things they say is like, you need a magical journal. You need to be writing down everything you do, every experience you have. And, whether you're looking at it that way, the way that you're talking, which I think the way you're talking about is very similar to that, actually. If I'm
Yeah.
reading you correctly, or you're taking it from like a Jungian perspective, right? Like dream journaling and all of that kind of stuff is like you're creating a record of things that you don't even realize you're creating a record of necessarily until you look back on it in hindsight.
Yeah.
And that will yield insights that you never would have had if you didn't write it down. Because even if you think you'll remember something weird that happened, I promise you after a few hours or week, you're not going to remember that shit.
Yeah.
Unless you write it down.
Yeah. And dreams are great. The more you tell your conscious mind that I want to talk to my subconscious.
Yes, right.
And that's because that is beaten out of us, here in the West. And there are other cultures that do it better. But it's something that can be relearned. And I do think, some people are naturally more gifted at this than others, but I don't think it's entirely a binary. Like if you're willing to put in the work, that's the other big thing. I've met a bunch of people that are interested in this, but they don't want to necessarily do the work to develop it. Or, I also say, I'm sorry, like having a meditation practice does yield incredible results, not just for like your mundane peace of mind, but it makes me a whole lot sharper at doing this. It makes me more inclined and want to do this. And that's work, it's not all Harry Potter.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's almost no Harry Potter, I think.
Yeah,
And it's mostly that, like what from the outside looking in, I mean, take my opinion worth a grain of salt, everyone. But from the outside looking in, it probably does look boring and it probably does look isolating and mundane. But yeah, I think everything you're saying, in my experience, is 100% a prerequisite for connecting with something, with whatever you want to call it, like the phenomenon, the deeper parts of the collective consciousness, unconscious. I think that's fantastic advice, man. And this has really been fun. I really appreciate you
Michael,
spending so much time. I think we got into some territory I haven't heard you riff on before. So I think people will really dig it, man.
Yeah. Thanks for your time, Michael.
Absolutely, brother. All right, let's do it again. And hopefully we can do something in person at some point.
Yeah. Love to.